Hello, this is Dominic Bradbury. I'm the author of The Atlas of Mid-Century Modern Houses, and you're listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. In a mid-century world before Instagram, people kept up with the latest buildings primarily through architecture magazines. Although a few titles, like Architecture Record, are still going, there were many exceptional publications back in the day. That heyday was 1945 to about 1970, and those publications reached millions of readers across the U.S. and the world. Today, we welcome John Morris Dixon, the last editor of one of the great magazines, Progressive Architecture. And now, the world's biggest Bjarke Ingels fan, Mr. George Smart.
Hi, folks. I mean, seriously, have you Googled Bjarke Ingels lately?
Do you hear that sound when you hit Google?
His firm, BIG, that's B-I-G, is kicking out one amazing project after another across the world. We've started building an archive at www.usmodernist.org/Ingels, but we really need your help because we can't keep up. If you know of a project we haven't documented, please send details to me at george@usmodernist.org. And I'm in New York just about every month. So let's say you can set up a lunch at Scandinavia House with Bjarke or his CEO, Sheila Sogard. That would just be delightful. We will roll that into a future episode of the show. Just like the old movie, My Dinner with Andre, it will be My Lunch with Bjarke. Jody Brown has an amazingly funny blog called Coffee with an Architect. He took a little hiatus for a year or two, and he's back. And his latest segment is about architectural fees, where he talks about how he determines how much to charge you as a client. So let's go through some of the top 10 of the Jody Brown fees list. Number 1, my fees will be inversely proportional to how much your project makes me hate myself. Number 2, my fees will be adjusted to account for how much time you spend looking at the drawings, and I give a discount if you actually look at the drawings. Number 3, my fees will increase if you review the drawings with your nephew who went to, quote, design school. Number 4, my fees will increase as my patience decreases,
That makes
which
sense.
will reflect the quality implied by the design of my business cards. Number 5, my fees cover the work I do as well as the work you don't do. Number 6, no, my fees are not too high. Stop laughing. Number 7, the invoice, however, will remove the barrier between the interior and exterior of your wallet.
Oh, I get it.
Number 8, I charge more for more details. I charge even more for less details. Number 9, my fees cannot be reduced by having me do less because, of course, less is more. And number 10,
architecture humor, I'm getting it.
my fees will be marked up 20% if you choose your own colors, and 50% if you have your spouse choose the colors. All right.
As we record today in mid-March, we're just starting to deal with the coronavirus crisis, all hunkered down in the studio here at Soundtracks in Raleigh. So George and I are at least 8 feet apart.
Yes, 8 feet.
I showered in Purell before we came over. George, I think he used Clorox, but Cameron, our engineer in the booth, has a mask.
Yes.
I think it's a Joker mask, though. Something tells me that that kind of mask won't actually help keep out a virus, but even under good circumstances, you're probably better off staying away from someone in a Joker mask. So maybe Cameron's...
Social distancing, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
that's it. Support for U.S. Modernist Radio comes from Nichiha.com/U.S. Modernist and modernist realtor Angela Roll.
Beauty, love, durability, designed to last for years to come, bringing you peace and tranquility. You feel relaxed, knowing your house can easily achieve any exterior look and any color Say it with me. Nichia. Advanced engineering. Nichia. Nichia. Durability. Textures. Finishes. And colors. Visit nichia.com/US Modernist. Nichia. 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 That's NICH. Wait for it. A look you'll love. Nichia.
I love that spot. It just puts me in the right zone. Thank you, Nichia. Okay, let's get our guest on. An architecture graduate of MIT, John Morris Dixon left architecture in 1960 for the green pastures, very tiny green pastures, of architectural journalism, working first with Architectural Forum and later Progressive Architecture, or PA, eventually becoming editor-in-chief in 1972 through its closing in December 1995. He has chaired the AIA National Committee on Design, on which he remains active, and he is involved in the preservation of modern architecture with the Docomomo chapter, New York Tri-State.
By the way, Docomomo stands for the Documentation and Conservation of the Modern Movement.
That's true. We got to explain all our abbreviations here.
My job.
Thanks, Tom, for that. John Morris Dixon has interviewed and written about just every modernist architect we've ever mentioned on the show. And his books include Paul Rudolph, Inspiration and Process in Architecture, Urban Spaces 1 and 2, Progressive Architecture's 20 Years of Design Awards, Pencil Point's Reader, Crick and Sexton, From There to Here, and Nourishing the Senses, Restaurant Architecture of Bentel and Bentel. Welcome, John.
Bentel and Bentel.
Oh, Bentel and Bentel. I should have checked that.
I got a journalist, a person involved in print, correcting the pronunciation. I'm very impressed.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, we didn't do podcasts, but anyway, we did think of it. Okay.
Well, let's start with you at architecture school at MIT, all primed to be an architect. When was that, and what led you to pursue this crazy profession?
Well, I had grown up in a small town on the Jersey Shore and had been very interested in watching things being built. Anyway, rather naively, I applied to MIT because they had a Bachelor in Architecture program, which took 5 years. The architects are such masochists that you had to go 5 years for a bachelor.
These days, it's almost routine.
Yeah.
Yes, it was routine. Only architects. So I applied to MIT, and I got in, and I loved it, at least for the first 4 years. It got tiresome after a while. I soon found that once we got into actual design, I found that I was doing better in the classes where I submitted papers than I was in design as such. And I worked for the school paper the whole time. Actually, I was working with Steve Clement, who for many years was the editor of Architectural Record later in our lives.
And who was teaching at the school at the time? Who were some of the professors you studied with?
Yeah, we were at a time when there were a number of young faculty members, Carl Koch, Hugh Stubbins, and some others, who were just beginning to have successful practices. So it was sort of chancy whether they were ever going to arrive in the drafting room at the appointed times because they were juggling their schedules. So anyway, nobody really, Lawrence Anderson was the backbone of the whole school.
Yes.
And was doing some very good buildings. Pietro Beluschi was the dean, but we used to talk about him as he did wonderful buildings. I love Beluschi's buildings. But as a dean, he was usually off on some committee or some panel or something, and we didn't see that much of him.
I think all deans are gone on some panel, pretty much.
I guess. I mean, they have various degrees of conscientiousness in the school. Probably architecture schools have a worse problem than, scientists kind of stick around the campus, but architects are popping off to some client meeting or something. Before I got out of school, I decided that what I really like to do is write about architecture. And of course, there must have been at some point a maximum of 50 people doing architectural journalism all over the country. Now there are fewer. first I was in the Army for 2 years. Almost all of my contemporaries were in the Army or the Air Force or whatever.
Was this after MIT?
After MIT, yeah.
Okay.
The Korean conflict had broken out this summer. We graduated from high school, so the wise thing to do was to continue with ROTC at school, which would keep you out of the draft, but obligate you to go in when it was over. Sort of a mixed blessing that I got sent to Korea and Japan. The fighting was over in Korea, but everything was a shambles. I've since found out that Peter Eisenman was like 15 miles up the road from where I was in Korea, for instance, and had some time to do some sightseeing, architectural sightseeing around Japan. So it was very educational. Anyway, got back.
Where did you go to work as an architect, to practice with other firms?
For a while, for a few months, for George Nemeny in New York, who was doing really elegant modern buildings, but he also had no money and no business sense that I could determine. And
Yeah, those two things usually go hand in hand.
Yeah. What? Doing good architecture and not having any...
Well, I was going to say no money, no business sense, but...
Yeah. Being a good architect and having no business sense also goes hand in hand, I think.
Yes.
So anyway, he finally had to hire somebody with higher qualifications than I did. Interesting, he had a woman there, Debbie Reiser. Then there was also Dick Henderson, who became Charlie Wathan's partner.
Right, Richard Henderson. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, he was the mainstay of the office, and he and Debbie were they really made things function. So anyway, when he decided he wanted somebody with higher qualifications than mine, which were essentially zip, he had to let me go. And then I went to work for Daniel Schwartzman, who designed mainly department store interiors. This is really scraping bottom in terms of
the hierarchy of needs, yes.
So anyway,
Maslow's basement.
they were building all these shopping centers around the country with the big Macy's. That's the kind of thing we were doing. We were doing the cabinet work. One of my Army buddies, who was in New York and had just completed journalism school at Columbia, called me one evening and said, I'm going through the Journalism Want ads, and there's an ad for an architecture magazine. They might be interested in you. So it was just this chance that I had this Army buddy looking through journalism employment ads, and I went on my noon hour the next day. I went to the employment agency and, filled out a little paper. And the woman looked at it and said, I think they want somebody with more experience than you. So I didn't think much about it. But by the time I got back to the office, back to the drafting board, I had a message that I had to call. I called, and it was the managing editor from PA. And, he said, we'd like to meet. And I said, when? And he said, this afternoon. And after work. And I said, well, I'm not really dressed well. I don't give a damn how you're dressed.
Well, those kind of calls don't happen anymore. Usually it's like weeks or months to get an interview these days.
I know, but they were desperate, apparently.
And they asked you for a writing sample?
No, they hadn't.
That was coming at the drinks later, I think.
Okay, they want to see how well you were dressed first.
Yeah.
Oh, well, no, they didn't, apparently.
No. Anyway, he didn't care how I was dressed. We met at a bar, of course. So we talked, and he was very interested. He never saw any writing I had done at that point. And it was, come in for an interview. And I said, well, when? And tomorrow morning. So I had to call in sick and go to the interview. I met the then editor of PA, who was really he had created PA out of Pencil Points magazine, which had been the magazine for the drafting room. Creighton had transformed it into PA. I was ushered into his office, and we had a little discussion. And they had had problems with young architecture-trained people who basically wanted the job as a networking opportunity where they would meet other architects, and in a few months they'd spin off to somebody's firm. And they were worried about that. So fortunately, I talked to faculty people at MIT about my interest in writing about architecture. And within a matter of hours, they had talked to a couple of people there and confirmed that was a long-term interest that I had, and I got the job.
Now, at this time, this was around 1960, right?
1960, yes.
There were not many people in architectural journalism. Who were some of the writers of that era?
There were probably more people than there are now because the staffs are now like cut to the core.
Ada Louise Huxtable, I think she was going then?
She was writing for I guess she had begun writing for the Times. She was like the greatest of newspaper architectural journalists I think we've ever seen. And she had been writing a series every few months in PA on old industrial buildings, 19th century industrial buildings. Creighton was like one of the key persons.
What were some of the most popular magazines of that era? And also maybe some of the most beautiful? I realize they may be two different lists, but what would people read in 1960 that was about architecture?
The U.S. magazines, it was like the big three were Architectural Forum, which was published then, by Time Inc., and was relatively lavish because they didn't care whether it made money or not. It was like so incidental on their balance sheet. And it was a pet interest of Henry Luce, who was the head of the whole place. So that was the beautiful magazine with the best printing of the time. You had Peter Blake writing then at Architectural Forum, Walter McQuaid.
And Peter Blake went on to do Architecture Plus for a couple of years, I recall.
Yes, it never really took off. And I wasn't, at that point, I was the editor of PA, and I wasn't rooting for him.
Yeah, of course.
I had had enough of his little comments on the margins of what I wrote when I worked for him. It's like he usually just wrote AWK. So
awkward.
Yes, but he never filled you in on.
Yeah.
He just wrote AWK in the margin.
Awkward.
So I really got some very good experiences at 5 years at PA. It was then when the Forum was then revived. In 1965, Luce had retired from Time Inc. They decided they didn't want this money-losing magazine any longer. They just want to cease publications. And then this nonprofit, Urban America Incorporated, decided to pick it up and make it their publication. So at that point, Peter Blake invited me to leave PA, which I was happy to do because the editor then was really difficult to deal with, and join Forum. That was a big boost, actually, because I was dealing with Peter Blake and his managing editor, Don Canty, who was brilliant, and a fine art director. So I learned a lot. I mean, the first articles I wrote for Forum, really did get seriously trashed. Canty, did you ever know Canty or know of Canty?
No, I don't know that name.
Oh, anyway, he was the managing editor there, and then Urban America Incorporated took him off to edit their City magazine, which they published for a number of years.
Was that architecturally focused at all?
Yeah, it was urban design focused and urban policy focused as well. But anyway, I would hand him a draft of an article, and he would look at it and kind of say a few things, and then he'd say, well, just leave it with me for a few minutes. And what he would do was stick paper in his typewriter and just redo the whole thing.
Oh, no.
And, he'd come back a half hour later with his whole revised version. So I learned a lot from that, actually.
Was it an improvement, you think?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. He was actually possibly the only journalism graduate I had ever worked with in magazines. It's interesting who was there and who wasn't. You had to have a few people who had architectural education. You had to have a few people who were really good at reading drawings. But on the other hand, Don Canty was the only journalism graduate that I remember working with. And, of course, they had all been working at Time Inc., where journalism was a very high standard of just plain writing. And Blake was a very good writer. I remember that sometimes we would have a very short time to get something written. I remember Blake saying, well, we could assign it to somebody else, but then we'd waste time passing it to me, and I'd edit it and so on. So I'll just do it.
Right.
Take less time.
And to put this into context for our listeners, imagine Dwell magazine. Most people know Dwell.
Yeah.
Well, Architecture Forum and Progressive Architecture at the time were 2 to 3 times as thick and a lot bigger as magazines. So you had somewhere between, 200 and 300 pages during that time in an issue?
Very often we'd get up close to or past 300 pages.
I bet mailmen love that magazine.
Yeah.
Thud.
But just, I mean, an incredible array every month of photos of unbelievable architecture that was going up during that era. I mean, it really documented what was happening across America.
And gave you something to archive.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Across the world, too. I mean, we were definitely following. I mean, at Forum, we did a big issue when Le Corbusier died. We just put everything else off and just dedicated the whole issue just to his work. And Peter Blake was often going off to Germany. He was born in Germany and had to leave during the Hitler years. He was educated in England. He always sounded English. He made quite a point of sounding English. But anyway, he would suddenly be going off to Germany, and we all concluded on the staff that we didn't figure out how he was paying for that. And we concluded that he must have really been a CIA agent. On the side.
A spy story.
After he got to the States, he was in the U.S. Army. He was in the U.S. Army when they occupied Germany. And we figured he probably had a very valuable background that the CIA could use. Anyway, that's somewhat off
That's
the point.
another story. Yeah.
Okay.
If you'd like to see what we've been talking about, the U.S. Modernist Library has nearly every single copy of Progressive Architecture and its predecessor, Pencil Points, online at www.usmodernist.org/library, along with 2.8 million other pages of architecture magazines. Warning, these magazines are highly addictive, so if you go there, be prepared to stay a while.
Bring a lunch.
And while you're perusing all of that, let's hear about modernist realtor Angela Roll. In an adventure we are largely making up, Angela Roll was in the CIA science lab washing beakers from the day converting peanut butter into jet fuel when suddenly a beaker of the thick brown goo broke, cutting her arm and covering her in highly classified chemicals. You can't even get them on eBay. As a warm glow came over her and soft violin theme music mysteriously began to play, she realized she had a superhero origin story. As she passed modernist houses, she instantly knew the right market value of each house, including how to fix them up. And now she had superpowers.
Yeah.
As market girl, Angela could predict modernist sales pricing with laser focus. Although ridiculed by other superheroes who could bend steel or walk through walls or shoot martinis out of their eyes, Angela put her powers to work closing sale after sale thanks to her architecture training, which is a real thing, and advising modernist buyers and sellers on pricing strategy and, extra added bonus, how to bid on the Price is Right.
Yeah.
Angela Roll is your special agent. Reach her at angelaroll.com. That's ROEHL or 919-995-0550.
Thank you, Tom. We're back with John Morris Dixon, former editor of Progressive Architecture. John, tell us about the famous and super highly regarded Progressive Architecture Awards program, a series of honors that put many architects on the map.
Yes, we did put a lot of architects on the map, and some of them are grateful.
And some not, huh?
Some of them just figured that it was inevitable that they would be famous. But the Stephen Hole, for instance, has been very good about saying, even in recent years at the Progressive Architecture Awards, which are still
going on.
He said that Progressive Architecture basically, as you said, put him on the map. And he was very good about submitting repeatedly. And, well, there's a couple of things come to mind here. One is I found some correspondence once that showed that basically a deal had been made with the American Institute of Architects. The PA, I think, had tried some kind of a prize for completed buildings, and that was what the AIA was doing and is still doing, having the honor awards for completed buildings, completed interiors, urban design, whatever. And so they had some kind of an agreement that PA agreed that they would only have a program for buildings in the design stage. So there was a bit of a deal made that launched that. But it was brilliant because not only did the magazine publicize the works that the juries chose, and they chose, excellent jurors, the caliber that many of the world's most famous architects had served at one point or another as PA jurors. I mean, in the early years, you had Lou Kahn and Gordon Bunshaft and Walter Gropius. on the juries. And later on, we, in my years, almost invariably have at least one foreign architect, Fumihiko Maki or James Sterling or...
I understand that when you became PA editor, there had only been 2 women ever on a PA jury. Do you remember who they were, and what changes did you make in jury composition?
Yes, that's true. There had only been 2 in the 18 years or something. One of them was Aline Saarinen, who was not an architect, but at that time was a partner in the successor firm after her husband, Eero Saarinen, had suddenly died.
And she was a reporter, I think, for NBC before that?
Yes, and she wrote for the New York Times sometimes and various things. She was kind of a journalist both in print and on the air. So she was very good. I still remember, of course, everything was submitted in huge, bulky, messy binders and rolls and on and on. And at PA, this was in the early 60s, we had a huge table, a huge conference room table. It must have been, 15 or 20 feet long or something. And the table would be covered with layer after layer. There would be the educational buildings on one layer, the residential buildings on another layer, and so on by type. And I remember that as we got down to the final discussions, I remember Aline Saarinen sitting on the table, and I couldn't help thinking that it was such a casual, offhand position to be in at this august event. Anyway, the other woman had a firm of her own in Washington, Clothiel Smith. Clothiel Smith was the only other woman, and she had a fairly prosperous firm in Washington. There was a lot of fairly low-profile construction going on there that she did. And so those were the 2 that I remember up to then. Once I was there, and with the other editors, who were a wonderful group, I mean, I was not alone there by any means. We decided right away that we would have at least one woman every year. And then we kind of increased the jury, so we had certain jurors for planning and other jurors for research. So we typically have 2 or 3 women among 8 people, or we might have 4 women among 8 people. I don't know whether we ever reached that category. But the number of women, of course, in architecture was...
very small at the time.
Yeah, well, it's still, slow. The proportion of people getting architectural degrees these days is about half, right?
I think so. It could be a little bit ahead, I think.
You mean
Maybe a little ahead, but it doesn't stay ahead as they progress.
The number of people with degrees who then go into the field?
Who stay in the field a certain number of years.
Okay.
50%. Women choose to have families and choose other careers.
Do you think adding women to the juries helped promote women to pursue architecture?
Oh, I'm sure. I mean, I can't tell about my own daughter because she was dragged around to look at buildings forever.
Yeah, it's different when you're the
dad. As all architects' children are.
Yeah.
There are not many firms, though, that go on from generation to generation. There's still a very small percentage where...
very few.
Where the next generation joins the firm. Your podcast with Eric Saarinen kind of addressed that. Where were we? So with the PA Awards, we also made a point, and it was harder to make the point of having more African Americans on the jury. There, of course, had never been an African American on the jury before 1972. We brought a few in, but the progress, very sadly, the progress of African Americans in the field hasn't been quite as effective as the progress of women.
Now, the awards program was really an incredible way to generate future stories from the magazines from all the entries, whether they won or not, right?
Yes. I had, at times it was like, at some point when I was at the magazine, it was like, okay, when the program is over, we're just going to package up all these things and send them back, because that was an obligation at the time, to take all these heavy binders and stuff.
And get them out of the office? Get them off that table?
And so I remember pleading and making a good case for going over them very carefully and seeing what the editors wanted to follow, whether the jury had chosen them or not. It was obvious, just a gold mine of indications of where to look next. So we pretty much did that whenever I was involved.
You could get months and months of material from that awards program.
Yes. I mean, some of them, of course, would somehow crash and burn and not get built or not get built the way they looked. But we had to press very hard to get them to sign a statement that we had to ask them who was the client how to reach the client, swear that the client was really going to do behind this, because it became a problem of just cooking up some scheme and submitting it to the awards, and if it wasn't really for a client, it just twisted the whole project.
So they were cooking up fictional buildings that had no client.
Yeah, right. And
okay.
They may have been fascinating, but that didn't really fit the mission of the program, or have the readers confident that they were really looking at something real.
Are there any buildings that you really hated during those years that you've changed course on now?
Buildings I hated were not. The ones I remember hating most, I still hate.
Okay.
Like Johnson's AT&T building in New York.
That was the one with the
thing on top.
Yeah, the thing. What was the thing?
Chippendale.
The
Chippendale. Right.
I wrote when the design came out, I wrote a whole editorial called "Take It from the Top." About how thoughtless it all was. Johnson would put us in a funny position. I mean, there are many Johnson buildings I really admire.
Sure.
Certainly his house, but or the Science Tower at Yale, the theater in Cleveland, the wonderful garden in Fort Worth, Water Garden in Fort Worth, Texas, a great public park, or the New York State Pavilion at the World's Fair.
Oh yeah, we've had a whole show on that.
Yep.
Yeah, it's brilliant. Anyway. Johnson was erratic, and he'd somehow once in a while come up with something really dumb, almost adolescent. Still, if I'm in New York and I see the top of it, I just sort of cringe. And there were issues with the Docomomo, whether they should fight to preserve it. Who was it? Had a proposal for the lower
Snowhetta,
floors.
I think.
Yes, Snowhetta.
To preserve the building?
They were going to renovate the building, and there
They
was
were
a question
renovate
on whether they should
de-Chippendale it?
Yeah.
No, they weren't going to change the Chippendale, but they were going to do something pretty stupid, frankly. Along the street, they were going to alter the base of it, which was not good to begin with. It was really forbidding, and I remember hearing that whoever was the head of AT&T at the time ruled out having retail buildings at the base, which typically, even some of the most prestigious office buildings, including Seagram's and CBS and so on, did have retail at the base. And older ones almost invariably had that. And he didn't want to walk into his office past a millinery shop or whatever it was.
Those darn CEOs.
A tattoo parlor.
I tell you.
Right. I don't think on Madison Avenue a tattoo parlor would.
Yeah, you'd have to have expensive tattoos there.
Right.
John, how did progressive architecture come to an end in 1995?
It was just strictly a money issue. I'm getting into some sensitive stuff here, but
it has been 25 years. Is there a statute of limitations we can go to for this?
I don't think the statute of limitations. The AIA had these deals with publishers. Now I'm trying to think here. The publishers of what was then Architecture magazine. Right.
That was the official magazine at that point.
That was the official magazine
of AIA.
But they had an agreement that terminated at a certain. It terminated, I believe it was ending in '96. Anyway, they simply auctioned off the rights to be the AIA magazine. I mean, they wanted proposals from publishers about what kind of a deal they could make in terms of what the magazine would cost.
And that's when Hanley Wood got it?
No, that's when Hanley Wood lost it.
Lost it, okay.
Yeah, and then that's when Record picked it up. Hanley Wood had it for a period of years before that, and they lost it then. Meanwhile, PA, when I first went to it in 1960, was one of 2 or 3 publications from Reinhold Publishing. We also published books. They were major architecture book publishers at the time. By 95, there had been mergers and acquisitions and more mergers and acquisitions. We then belonged to a company that published over 30 magazines and answered to a holding company which controlled them.
Oh, those are the worst.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what happened was they were kind of hurting. The books didn't look very good for 1995. And meanwhile, Hanley Wood lost the AIA account and went to Record. And Hanley Wood just basically lost their subscription list because, their subscription list had been AIA members, and they didn't have that any longer. and they needed desperately to round up some survivors, and they were willing to pay. And meanwhile, the company that owned PA was a little hurting, and they decided they could pick up some kind of seven-figure number by selling us and selling our rights, our name, our subscription list primarily. And that was it.
Okay.
So they just sold, and we were out on the street.
Now, although the magazine is gone, the PA Awards are still going on, right, through Hammerwood?
Yes, right away, each owner has maintained the PA Awards. They still exist, let me put it that way.
Are they scaled back now?
They seem to be scaled back. They have smaller juries. I'll let you decide whether they have as much impact as they used to. They certainly have impact, but as much, I don't know. But everything is now, the budgets for all the magazines have been scaled back more and more, and the staffs are much smaller than they were. And the whole economic situation was different.
Is there any online presence of note for architecture writing?
The magazines that still survive, Architect and Architectural Record, have online presence. I mean, I get, get notifications.
Everybody has a website now in addition to what they have in print.
I was wondering if there's any, like, online only that doesn't have a print counterpart.
Curbed, for instance.
Yeah, there's, what is it, Arc Daily that I get daily.
Arc Daily.
And Architecture Network. I might have the title right.
Architecture Newspaper has both online and print.
Okay. Yes, yeah, I get those. So
it seems like it's a subject matter, though, that lends itself towards the printed page.
Well, you'd think, but one thing I wanted to ask you, John, other than budget, of course, what do you see has changed the most in architectural journalism since PA ended?
Well, I think the thing that's changed the most is that there is an online presence, and there are certain advantages online. I mean, first place, you can do everything in color and not worry about the printing costs.
Oh, yeah, that was a big deal in those years.
Yes. Well, in my years there, we would probably get 2 pages or 4 pages of editorial pages in the whole magazine in color. Of course, by the 1990s, everything went through the color press, so it got to be more or less a non-issue. It was interesting, though, in those early years when we had a very small quota of color pages, there were still lots of color ads.
Oh, yeah.
Not all of them, but much higher percentage of the ads were in color than the editorial pages. As a career, the editors, we didn't make a hell of a lot of money, and the companies tended to give higher salaries to the people who sold ads or dealt with subscribers or whatever, because the editors only incurred expenses. We just ran up expenses, whereas, the ad salesman brought in revenue.
It was Mad Men, right?
Yes.
That is one of the oldest stories in media. The salespeople think that they pay the salaries of the editors, the writers, the reporters. I was in radio, the disc jockeys. It's like if we weren't there, they wouldn't care. They could just run ads all the time.
Yeah.
It's just a fact. I mean, it's just a fact who brings in the money and who spends it.
Yeah. But they don't have a product to sell unless you do your job.
Yes. I mean, for instance, or even subscription promotion, I remember saying, be sure that your company has so-and-so. I remember saying, I don't know how many times, we don't call them companies, we call them firms.
Oh, yes. The jargon of architecture.
Right.
Yes, right. It didn't make much money, but the perks were fabulous. I mean, I got to travel pretty much all over the world on the strength of either the magazine paid or somebody else paid because I was that editor. So anyway, there were lots of wonderful buildings and getting to wonderful places and so on.
Well, thank you for putting a happy ending on that story.
Yeah. John, this has been really great chatting with you. I'm so glad we had an opportunity to tap into your vast memory of these magazines.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening. You can see just about every issue of Pencil Points and Progressive Architecture and Architecture Forum and many more magazines in the U.S. Modernist Library, www.usmodernist.org/library. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Angela Roll, your special real estate agent for modernist houses, and by nichiha.com/US Modernist. Okay, Tom, take us out.
U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. It's recorded at Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song is performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Cindy Stratton, not her real name, will soon retire from guest research, we're sad to say, but she's been the best. I hope you have a cake for her.
Yes.
Thank you, Cindy. Visit usmodernist.org's massive modernist archives to hear past shows, discover 7,000 mid-century houses, and access 2.8 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines like the ones we've just been talking about.
Yes.
Plus, you can get our free weekly newsletter. Just contact George at george@usmodernist.org or on Instagram at mr.modernism. George and I will be back soon with another well-thumbed edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.